Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Clay Irvin. I'm the Director of Growth and Resource Management for Volusia County. And today we are starting on our second of our interactive sessions regarding affordable housing. We've initiated this effort back in July with a series of webinars where we were utilizing that to focus on the opportunities for affordable housing here in Volusia County and what can be done to facilitate it. Today, our discussion is going to be focusing on the various tools that are available to local governments in order to basically improve, expand, and facilitate affordable housing. But before we get into that discussion, I really would like to kind of go over where we've been. As I referenced, we did have a webinar session that initiated in July. And we started that with a discussion from the Florida Chamber, where they talked about their prosperity plans as part of their Florida 2030 blueprint. In which case, we talked about how affordable housing plays a critical part to many of the pillars that they're utilizing for that plan. We also talked about what was available as far as funding for affordable housing. That is a critical element nowadays as we see escalating prices and no real stop in the future in regards to that. We then talked about how we protect and preserve our affordable stock of affordable housing and looked at what the benefits and costs of trying to do so would be. We also looked at where and how a plan could come together. The first of these interactive sessions, which follows up on that webinar series, was where Jamie Ross, from President and CEO of the Florida Housing Coalition, identified those critical elements of what is a good affordable housing plan. So we will also have a third that will be coming up on October 22nd. But the one I really want to point out is that coming on December 7th, we are holding a countywide affordable housing summit at the Ocean Center in Daytona Beach. This is providing an opportunity for everyone who's involved with affordable housing. Local governments, regional governments, not-for-profit, profit developers, the whole gamut of the players who are involved with trying to provide for affordable housing will be there. Today, we have, I think, a great panel of professionals who've got a very diverse experience. I'm going to show a little quick video here, or excuse me, a PowerPoint in a few seconds, just to kind of give us a setting of where Volusia County actually is in regards to our populations and what we need and how our local governments are responding. And then what will happen is our panelists will get into their respective issues. So joining us today will be Robert Gray, or Bob Gray. He is the president of the Strategic Planning Group. They are an economic and development planning consultancy that was founded in 1983. And they've been a leader in many of the city and county governments as they prepare for affordable workforce housing strategies and policies. They've recently prepared an affordable housing linkage fee for the city of Daytona Beach and will be assisting the city with a broader plan to identify how to better target their policies and what can be done. They've done over 35 similar studies throughout the Southeast and have recently completed an affordable housing studies for Coral Gables, Dania Beach, Palm Beach Gardens, St. Petersburg, and the town of Eatonville. After we hear from Bob, after the presentation, we will hear from Catherine Hartley, who is the Director of Community Planning for Tyndall Oliver. They advise local governments on such things as comprehensive planning, zoning, affordable housing, impact fees, and multimodal transportation studies. She has 15 years of public sector planning experience, focusing her career on making traditional walkable places legal and comprehensive plans and zoning codes. Over the last 5 years, she has turned her attention to affordable and missing middle housing. She's now working with the Florida Planning and Zoning Association, who recognized her for her collaborative effort to implement, and I'm going to quote this, inspired and innovative planning solutions and creative strategies to provide quality affordable housing for the Addison, a mixed-use low-income tax credit affordable housing project in Bradenton, Florida. Lastly, we will hear from Jessica Gao, who is an associate attorney with Cobb Cole, a local law firm here in Daytona Beach. She has got a vast experience here with us in everything from environmental to land development to affordable housing. She currently serves on the executive board of the Affordable Housing Committee for the Volusia County Association of Responsible Development, VCARD for those who are familiar with it. And she is also a member of our own Volusia County Forever Advisory Committee, and we appreciate her participation there. I also have to put a plug in for her recent article in the Florida Bar publication for the Environmental and Land Use Law section in their July edition, Home Sweet Home Rule, the role of local government in creating affordable housing. So now we have that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick PowerPoint so we can kind of frame where Volusia County is. And then once we're done with that, we'll kick in with Bob talking about overall where we can just look at what the planning tools spectrum consists of. Okay, sorry, getting there. For some reason, it is not showing up. Let me stop sharing real quick and get back to it. I love technical difficulties on Friday afternoons. Let's see if that will work. There we go. So again, what we're trying to focus on is finding the right tools in today's discussion. And this image I put together here kind of shows the linkage going from our comprehensive plan into the site-specific land development regulations right into the construction of hopefully affordable homes. As we as practitioners at the local level, we have to realize where the public is coming from. So anytime that you have this conversation, we need to make sure we understand, is the public really viewing this as being only a city issue, or is it a county-wide issue? In other words, where is it being framed? Does the public think that government should engage in providing assistance for affordable housing? And if they do, who are their targeted people that they feel needs assistance with this housing? And lastly, how strongly do you feel with various different programs that can be done to promote affordable housing? If we come to understand this from our public, from those who are in attendance as we go through these various projects, it'll help us understand where they're coming from so that hopefully we can better explain why affordable housing is so important. First of all, what is affordable housing? As you can see, the image of the house with all the different terms, there's literally hundreds of different terms that have been used for this. From Volusia County's perspective, we're identifying the standard idea that if housing is affordable, cost effective, if it doesn't cost more than 30% of the household income. So where does that hit? What is 30% of gross income? And here's some information that our community assistance department used in a presentation to our county council in May, and I think it's pretty effective. As you read across your screen from left to right, you see the individuals below poverty level, the extremely low, very low income, and finally low income families. And as you can see, these are different levels of annual median income, AMI. And so as we look at that, what does that mean as far as the population, and what exactly are we talking about dollar amounts? So as we sit here and think about it, think about our own paycheck that we get and how much buying capacity that has. And so as you sit here and you see these numbers, so 16% of individuals are below poverty level. Basically, they're at $322 of their money per month is the maximum that they should be expending for housing. As we look at extremely low income families, this is 8% of all the households in Volusia County. And that's looking at $663 per month. Very low incomes, which you see an annual income of between 26,000 up to 32,000, can spend between $663 to $818 per month and still be within that affordable range. And then lastly, 19% of our households are for low income families. And again, their limitations are between $818 to $1,308 per month. So we've got an idea of the amount of population that's impacted by this, and we've got an idea of how much out of their monthly paycheck they can spend. Who are these people? And this is an abridged table that was shown again back in May to our county council, but it gives you an idea of the occupations, what their median income, and then as you can see with the red in that column all the way on your right, it shows you that we are looking at anywhere from almost 40% to almost 60% of their income of these different professions are spent on just rent or some sort of monthly payment for their housing. So you have everything from bartenders to receptionists to housekeeping. And here in Volusia County, we do have a great reliance on our service industry. So when you start seeing the waiters and waitresses and all of the other sales folks, that's really hitting home here. Here's again, just kind of showing some of the deficiencies that we're facing. And this is based from information that we received from the Schimberg Institute out of the University of Florida. This is a great resource for anyone who's listening, who's a practitioner, who's looking for a way to kind of identify the same situation for their particular local government. And so what this provides is some idea of those who are in the 0 to 30%. We've got 6,000 units that are deficient. But in the next stage over here with affordable units, there are 5,800 that are lacking. So as you can see, as we work across the different income levels, we are still seeing a greater and greater level of deficiency in the provision of actual affordable units. Here gives an idea of where our population is landing in regards to percentages and those types of things as it's broken down by municipality. This is older data. I'm sure that as we get more and more information from the census, it'll become a little bit more fine-tuned and a little bit more up to date. But what you're still seeing is that we have a healthy percentage that are still in poverty, and there are folks that are in very low, moderate, and from 2025 to 2030. So this issue is not going to go away. And that, like the previous graphic, which showed the deficiencies, this is just compounding the fact that we are dreadfully lacking in the provision of these affordable units. So what is happening at the local level? Volusia County contacted our fellow local governments, the 16 cities that are within Volusia County, to try and get a gauge of where they are. You know, what were they doing? Did they make provisions for accessory dwelling units? Do they have linkage fees? Do they have inclusionary zoning? All of the basic tools that we've identified, and what you can see when you just do any kind of Google search about tools for, including affordable housing in your zoning ordinance. And unfortunately, there's a relatively limited palette of affordable housing tools throughout. A lot of this is a function of staff size and funding capabilities. And so what our goal ultimately to be coming up on the December 7th is being able to identify how those local governments that want to do more can do more by either partnership or modifications to their codes. There's increasing interest by local governments and their staff to improve and expand on the options for affordable housing. The reason why this is really important to us is that as part of the surveys, you could see that the respondents were that we are trying to get more going. We talked about how Jamie Ross spoke about what are the elements of a good plan. And as we were putting together this slide, Catherine and Bob both pointed out that many of these items that we're talking about here are critical for getting some of the bridge and gap financing that you can attain through the state or other sources. And so it's important for us as local planners to make sure we are able to identify these and geographically realize where we can get affordable housing. So real quickly, it's just, how's your transportation network? Is there something available there for those who may be disadvantaged because of income and can't necessarily afford that personal car, and so relies on public transit? Is there easy access to healthcare, education, and social services? This is critical. When you go for some of the bond funding and everything else, they'll be asking you to provide proof of how close you are to these different types of facilities, because it's imperative that regardless of the mobility of our people who need affordable housing, they need to be able to get access to these. Infrastructure. If you're dealing with a greenfield development, one of the worst things that you can do is have an exorbitant cost for provision of water, sewer, stormwater, and roads. Those are some of the major costs that can really draw down whether or not a project becomes affordable or not. Employment. We in Volusia County view affordable housing as part of our economic development strategy. If you don't have housing available for those new businesses that are locating here or those that you're trying to retain, you are coming into a gunfight with a knife. So we need to be able to make sure that we have this partnership of economic development and affordable housing. And one of the last items, and I think one of the most critical, is being able to provide that mix of use. We don't want to necessarily create targeted areas that become, whether rightfully or wrongfully, identified as slums. That was one of the main things that we realized, that integration of affordable units into market rate is going to be critical for any kind of success. So here's a quick listing of some of the tools that we have available. Many of y'all are familiar with it: donation of land, community land trust, linkage fees, expedited review process, and fee waivers, density bonuses, etc. Y'all can read the screen. Which ones work in your local government? That's what's got to be identified. That's what's got to be determined and what can be done, so that way, if you can't do all of them, what can you do, and can you do it well? Making sure that you have the staffing, making sure that you have the funding focused on that so that we can get these things accomplished. So now we're going to jump into our discussion. Starting off will be Bob Gray, and then he will provide us with some oversight about what's going on in Florida in general. Please feel free to go ahead and provide us with questions. There is a link down there that you can submit your questions, and we will take them throughout the presentation and discussion. And if we have time at the end, we will cover those that have not been addressed. Thank you. And if Bob, if you could, please go ahead and jump right in.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk. One of the things I would like to do is to get back to some specifics, because we're still at that 5,000 foot high looking down approach, but we're glossing over certain things that we find when we're doing studies, that there's a lack of understanding at the most basic level, even though you went through those categories of need by income. I think it needs to be addressed that from 0 to really 60% area median income households, a lot of the resource base is already there, either through the state or the federal government. Low income tax credits, a bunch of funding is accountable. Housing vouchers, there are a bunch of programs that can address that. When we're helping municipalities and counties, in many cases, we're really hitting the area, which is another term called workforce housing. And workforce housing tries to address basically those income groups that are not addressed under the federal programs and the like, and that is either at 60 or 80%. Most programs say federal programs will go up to 80, but they really don't. So in many ways, we look at the area of 60 to 120. And why that? In a lot of areas and in most areas, anything below 120% becomes very difficult for developers to develop. And within that mode, there's another handicap, if you will, and that is, are we talking rental or are we talking ownership? And that is beginning to change a little bit. Right now, to give an overview, the recent statistics are showing that, again, one of the major causes of the problem with affordable housing in general is lack of units, is the supply has just not been there for the last really decade and a half. I just saw some data that I thought was very interesting, is that supply has gone up increasingly by 50% this year. And it's been predominantly in the multifamily, and it's predominantly recent, because at the beginning of the year, lumber prices went up 300% plus from prior years. It's now back down to 30% of what it used to be, but so it's still more expensive. Steel is still at 300 to 400% over, and the indications right now that may or may not come down. So the cost of housing in general is high. The reason I'm saying it's changing is, for the last 5 to 10 years, we've changed a paradigm which went from an ownership to a rental. And some of that's demographics, some of that's lifestyle, some of that's affordability. We now see an increasingly focused group on equity development, if you will. How do people that are of color increase their wealth? And needless to say, that has a large function in discussions within the ownership group. So those are the things that we're trying to address as we go in and doing our studies. And as mentioned, we're in the process of working with the city of Daytona Beach to develop their program. And Clay, I might add, within the workforce side, because your thing looks at everything, from zero all the way up. If you look at that, the workforce side of the issue, and again, those are the critical issues that are related to economic development. They're the critical things in terms of, does my child have a chance to work and live in Volusia County or each of the cities? It's critical, I think, to understand that workforce housing in general is a different beast than affordable at the lower levels. And again, I just want to reiterate that one. The other thing I really want to get into the discussion so that everybody is on the same page of apples and oranges. Wages are not the same as household income. At the level that we're dealing with policies and all the things that go with that, we're dealing through HUD with a thing called household income. And we have to remember that increasingly over the last 20 years, over 60% of households now have 2 or more wage earners. So you have a dichotomy. You have the mother with children as a single wage earner. Those are at the bottom of the scale traditionally. And then as you start moving up the scale, you're starting to find a significant number of people that have at least 2 wage earners. So we have to be very careful when we're looking at the wage salary level and saying, how does that translate into affordable rent? It really depends on how many people and the household configuration, whether it's family or even just 2 unaccompanied people living together. So I want to stress, in one sense, which may be a positive, that when you take that into account, the numbers don't look as bad. That if you strictly sit there and say, how do the wage levels react to rents or ownership, it looks very, very bad. But the other side of the coin is there are two issues when it comes to affordability at the 50,000 foot level is income, what can you afford, and how do we improve that? And that's the hard one. Supply, how do we supply housing that is more affordable, i.e. less expensive to build, or have other incentives that can be applied. So that's sort of that gross level, Clay.
Hey, Bob, real quick, what do you feel, and again, this is just based on a quick question, how does the increasing minimum wage impact what's going to happen in regards to ability to get affordable housing?
I'm going to be pessimistic here. I mean, an economic answer would be that, oh, it's going to improve it. $1, $3, $4 an hour difference is not going to make it sizable because housing costs are increasing faster than wages. So we did see a little bit of a peak at the beginning of the year where wages were increasing a little bit faster than the CPI, Consumer Price Index. But when it really applies to housing in general, if you take that out of that CPI portion, it's increasing faster. And this is not the old model where we had with the collapse back in the 80s and stuff. These are real reasons. The market's not necessarily driving it anymore. We're seeing it slow down in appreciation. But when you look at land costs, construction costs, and labor, they're all going up at different levels, but in most cases, they're going up a lot higher than the normal wage.
So if that translates into like a very quick remedy, because it takes away a time for the market to adjust to those increases in the salary, because again, you increase the salary, whoever's paying that salary has to raise their price, and then it circles back to the provider of affordable housing. So in the long run, you see that basically you're not going to gain much, because whatever you gain in that income will have an equal or greater increase because of the cost.
Correct. You have to focus on the supply side.
So as we go through this, one thing that I've brought up to this group in some of our preliminary discussions before we got into this was what directly or indirectly, what cost, direct or indirect cost, does a local government have control over and assistance to a developer of affordable housing? So I'm going to ask this of Bob and Catherine and Jessica as we go through this. When we as a local government practitioner look at what we have in our toolbox, what items do we have that we can help with a reduction, either directly by a code change or donation of land, or indirectly through other actions? So again, are there any things that you see or think of right off the top of your head that could help out? And I'll ask you, Bob, since you've got the...
Well, I think there are immediate ones and then longer term ones. The immediate one, you have to deal with land costs. Okay, because land costs, depending on where you're at, can be 25% or more of the total end cost for housing. And that can be accomplished in a number of ways. And I don't think we're addressing it statewide enough. We talk about it, but we don't. And that's the donation of lands. And when I say donation, I mean basically what public lands are out there that can be repositioned. For example, we were doing a project in South Florida where they were building a new library. So we put housing on top of the library. There are creative ways to do that don't really impact staff as much in other things. Then on the other side of the coin, on the land cost, is increasing density. Okay, that's a two-edged sword, because to increase density, in most cases for inclusionary zoning purposes, the existing zoning has to have a limit. For example, we were doing the plan for Coral Gables. Well, their zoning was so aggressive that there really was the allowed zoning allowed for more than the market even could build. So I couldn't put inclusionary zoning there. It has to be something where it says, okay, like we're doing in Palm Beach, there was a limit on the downtown area where there was a TOD going on in. So we could take that limit and say, okay, hey, you can build, 3 stories, but that was the limit. So now we came in and we say, okay, hey, you can build 12 stories. And so the developer in that case has the ability to recover portions of his land costs to the point where land is taken out of the equation for affordable housing. Okay, that works in most places. It did not work in Coral Gables, because in Coral Gables, people were taking options on land, and so not buying it until they got the zoning changed. But then the sellers now are smart enough to know is they're remaining open to the point where if you get more density, they're going to charge more for the land. So depending on where you're at, that may or may not work. So if, in other words, if the land contract allows the seller to do it on a unit basis and that unit basis changes, the price goes up, we've lost another tool. Okay. And then the other one I would address to the team and we're looking at, and I think this is going to be the critical one in the longer term. We just have not addressed housing in terms of building codes and having flexibility. There are many things out there that are proven now that we can produce housing for less money. And I think we need to start looking at that. And then the lastly thing that I still think is the silver bullet for the big area of affordability, and I don't think we're doing enough job on that, are ADUs. If you look at accessory dwelling units, to me, we need to focus more on how we get more people to want to build those, because it's not only on the side of the coin of saying it's affordable housing, but it's also economic development, so that the person, and usually in this case, they're older people, can actually get income from that accessory unit. So it kills 2 birds with 1 stone. So that's my quick overview.
That was really helpful. As you were talking, the planner and me came out, and I was sitting there thinking about that comp plan policy that you can put in and sit there and say that before the government does any kind of new expansion of existing facilities, they have to research the capability of provision of mixed use for affordable housing as well as the civic use. So then that way, when we as a county or when some of the cities look at trying to do improvements at some of their facilities, is there an opportunity to partner with a private developer to get affordable housing in there? That would be a really interesting one. And the good thing, and Bob, you touched on something that was in the survey, that many of the local governments here are really looking hard and fast at ADUs, and some of them have initiated some changes. I know that Daytona Beach recently did that. We've recently done it. So hopefully that will provide us some of those.
There's been some good studies on that, and of why a lot of places have legislation to allow that, but they're not getting built. So we have to look at what are the barriers, and there's some good studies that have come out recently on how you remedy a lot of those barriers.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. A lot of that was really insightful. We did have a question in that, and this is something that I'll ask you, and I'll also ask Catherine, is how do we determine our need for affordable housing? I put up this Schimberg, and it talks in aggregate, and you can get into the cities, but how do you really focus in on what the true need is?
I will answer that the way we do in our studies. I think the first thing is that we look at is what your tables showed, is in terms of converting jobs to households, how many households are spending more than X number on not just housing, but housing and transportation. One of the things that you've sort of addressed that verbally. There's some very good studies that are showing what the cost of housing and transportation is, and it's shocking because housing may be number one, but right behind it is transportation. So it's not uncommon for transportation to be 15 or 20% of the income. So you throw that on top of the housing cost, and there's not a lot for groceries or medical and the like. So you can measure those in terms of sort of ranges. And then that's defining what you have. And then the next question is, right now you have people that if they're in an ownership situation, it's hard to deal with, okay, because they're owning, but at least they're getting equity and some other things out of that one. On the rental side of the equation, you can sit there and say, okay, do we have enough, and what is the condition of the housing and all that. And then on the other one, because we're in a growing economy, we have to address, needless to say, the people that are coming in. So we can define demand, and we can get some calculations there, and we can sit there and it's not that hard to address what the market can supply without some kind of assistance. And that's called market grade. So it's really looking at market grade minus demand, and you'll come out with a number. And I might address that one thing that unfortunately, because of politics, I've not been able to do in too many places, is when you do a plan and you go through all these studies, try to come up with a number that you want to do. You're not going to address everything all at once, but do you want to try to have a goal of 1,000 units or 100 units or whatever, with the ability to use your toolbox, but try to put something down, and hopefully you'll exceed that.
Definable metric.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Well, Catherine, do you want to pick up our conversation from here and kind of drill down a little bit more? For those of you who aren't familiar, she just recently did a presentation for the Florida chapter of the American Planning Association, was able to kind of identify 10 quick and easy ways that local governments can improve their abilities to provide for affordable housing. So, Catherine?
Sure. So I just wanted to follow up on what y'all were saying about ADUs. And that's one of the code hacks that I usually advise people to do. I was the planning director for the city of Bradenton for a number of years, and I would get calls every week about whether or not someone can build an ADU in their backyard. And anecdotally, I can tell you that 99% of those calls were folks around my age who were inquiring because they had a parent that they needed to not necessarily take care of, but to keep an eye on, because they were getting a little older. They still wanted independence, and some privacy, but they needed to be, in proximity to the family. And so that's a little less scary to elected officials, I think, when you have that argument. So it's good to have that in your back pocket. One of the code hacks that I employed as the planning director, all of our zoning districts except for one allowed for accessory dwelling units. And we were in the middle of doing a land development code update, and our intention was to add that into that other zoning district, but we still had the demand for them to be built. And so what I was telling homeowners and builders was that, listen, all the zoning districts, and this one in particular that didn't allow ADUs, did allow for accessory structures. There was no prohibition against someone living in that structure. And so typically a dwelling unit in a lot of land development codes is defined by whether it has cooking facilities, right? A stove. And so I told these folks, listen, go ahead and plumb it and put in the electrical like you would for a normal, residence. Just don't drop the stove in when we give you this, the CO. And we'll deal with that later after we do the code update. But you know what? Have a microwave, a hot plate, sink, all that stuff. But for now, to keep it legal, just don't drop that stove in. And so that was one of the ways that I was able to get around that legally and make that judgment call as a planning director. Some of the other things that you can do, very basic, is reduce your parking. I know that can be a little bit scary, but if you're in proximity to transit, why do you need 2 spaces per dwelling unit? Even for commercial uses, once you get over 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet, you literally have more parking than you do building. And so you kind of have to start rationalizing that, right? Another thing that tends to take up a lot of space are landscape buffers. Sometimes they're not necessary. And if you think about a more urban place, what's more important is the streetscaping versus having a huge rear yard buffer to separate uses. And quite frankly, in my professional opinion, I think that those big landscape buffers are part of the reason why we don't have great connectivity today. And it takes you longer to get somewhere, particularly by walking or riding a bike. And so that's another little thing that you can take a look at in your land development code. And it's not necessarily, when you talk to elected officials, it's not necessarily supporting affordable housing, it's supporting any kind of housing, really. And so again, that's a little less scary to folks.
Mind if I interrupt you real quick
Sure.
on that? Is there a critical mass in regards to what is defined by urban and non-urban where that would apply? Because one of the concerns I have is that the Florida Trend article that occurred several months ago, where there was a developer from St. Pete talked about how the elimination of the parking requirements gave her greater coverage and greater opportunity to provide it, which I think all of us here would love to be able to do. But I believe that St. Pete's ability to provide transit is a little bit better than what we're experiencing in Volusia County.
Sure.
So when can we grow up enough to get rid of parking?
You can, and here's how. Because I had this discussion in Fernandina Beach a number of years ago. It's a small town, it's only 10,000 people and has a very charming scale to it. For some reason in their comprehensive plan, they had this, didn't make sense. They had a limit citywide of density at 10 units an acre. It didn't make sense for them the way they were platted and, their traditional and historic downtown. And so the presentation that I did to the city commission was like, showing them pictures of their Main Street. And I said, do you love this? Well, of course we do. Well, do you want to see more of it? Well, of course we do. Well, then let's do the math. If you do commercial space on the bottom and then 2 units above, that's 32 units an acre. And you're a small town, so you just have to run the math for these folks because they don't understand unless, someone's explaining it to them. It's just numbers. And so showing them what that really means is very important. And so you don't have to have an 18-story, 100-story building to get good density that would support walkability and even minor transit. Some of the beach communities over here in Pinellas just have, little electric cars that run people back and forth. That's still transit. It's not large scale transit, but it's still helping you get around without being in a single occupancy vehicle. So if you just think about the scale and run the numbers, that's a way to define urban and suburban. It's really more about scale than anything else. So that's one way to look at it. Another thing to take a look at, it's a usual suspect in a code, is that most zoning districts will say you can only have 1 principal building per lot, right? Well, if you look at some of the cottage courts and pocket neighborhoods that are being developed today, which is getting pretty trendy, and that's one of the missing middle housing components, that could be 7, 10, 12 units on 1 lot, right? So it's still single family. Single family is not scary, right? But you're allowing more than 1 unit per lot. So that's another way to think about it. And then they don't have to plat on top of it. So that saves time and expense. Another thing to consider is your driveway widths. This can really impact the form and width of a place, of the lots in a place. A lot of places will have a 24-foot wide driveway requirement. That adds pavement. Excuse me, that's my dog. Excuse me for 1 second. I have a Great Dane and he's feeling needy right now. Of course, on the computer. So you have a 24-foot driveway width. You're adding cement, which, you know, is impervious surface. It adds cost. It takes up, you know, if you have only a 50-foot wide lot, that sidewalk you're missing now, right? So it's impacting walkability. So that's another thing to think about. Same thing with just basic lot widths. If you're in a more urban setting, does it really matter? It's your block size that's important. So think about that, just regulating block size versus lot widths. And then another thing you can do is just rely on your comp plan for density. In a lot of places, your future land use is now. So you can regulate the form in your zoning code and the density in your comp plan and think about it that way. Another usual suspect that's in zoning codes is minimum house size. A lot of places will have a minimum of 1,500, 1,800 square feet. I don't think that's necessary. It certainly adds to the cost. And you see today, smaller households, 2 people, 1 person in households, especially when you're just starting out. I'm still a single person household, so I don't need 2,000 square feet. And I think it's a little weird that local governments require such a thing, right? So that's another thing that you can make an argument to your elected officials that impacts the cost of housing for everybody, not just affordable housing. And the last thing is allowing garage conversions to accessory dwelling units. Excuse you. So even if it doesn't meet the setback requirements or other things in your code, because the garage has been there for forever, just allowing that non-conforming use to convert is one way that you can really promote ADUs. And that's my top 10 list of little things that you can do in your code.
Excellent. And when you go through these discussions, what kind of feedback have you experienced from the NIMBYs? And how can we as practitioners deal with that in a much more constructive way, so that way we can educate and hopefully win over some hearts and minds?
It's really important to find your champions in the community, and they're always there. It's just that happy people don't tend to show up at public meetings. It's usually just the angry people. And so finding those folks in the neighborhood who, again, just like folks my age that need that room for a parent, those could be your champions. And again, that's not so scary to local officials, elected officials. If I show up and say, hey, I need a room for my mom, can you please adopt an ADU ordinance? You know, that's powerful, just to have the neighborhood champions, for sure.
Well, one of the, and this is again opening it up to both you and Bob from the financial perspective, and Jessica, please jump in on this question as well. With this past legislative session, there was a law signed in where local governments could waive affordable impact fees for affordable housing.
Yeah.
Have y'all observed anyone making any changes to their ordinances for that? And I'll ask you, Catherine, and then afterwards, Jessica and Bob, please chime in.
A lot of local governments will already have that policy written into their local housing assistance plans as one of the strategies that that you use to promote when you get the SHIP funding. And so because housing folks and the planning and zoning folks are usually in very separate worlds, and sometimes the right hand's not talking to the left hand, planners can just take your LHAP, which is usually adopted by resolution, and you may already have that policy in place. And I can tell you it does make a big deal when you're talking about $11,000, $15,000, $20,000 per unit. It makes a big difference. One of the other things that the state promotes is waiving your building permit fees. That's hard for a lot of local governments because you have to pay for your building permit staff, right, to do their job. But another change in the legislation that same year was, you know, looking at your building fees and doing that. I think it's a 4 or 5 year rolling average. And so you gotta spend the money. And so you have that surplus. If you have a surplus, and you have to be careful about your budgeting, you can start to waive some permit fees for affordable housing. So you have that tool available. I would say use it cautiously because you don't know what's going to happen to the housing market, and you still got to pay your folks. But that is another, financial tool that you can use for sure.
Bob or Jessica, anything that you want to add on to that?
Well, let me add one thing when you're dealing with impact fees, and I think Jessica can address this probably better than I can, is a lot of times the question is, if you're allowing certain types of units, affordable housing, not to pay impact fees, who's covering the costs of that group? Because a lot of times if you're going for bonds or anything else on that process, you got to have some other way to cover those costs.
Some local governments, I think, and this is what,
Yep.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I'll chime in a minute.
I was just going to add, I think that impact fee credits are a tool that a lot of local governments discuss. And there are considerations that you take into effect. Are there, higher fees for other types to balance that out, like Bob says? A lot of times developers that we work with in their pro formas, they have concurrency and impact fees kind of tied together, because normally when you have a proportionate share or utility connections or things like that, they contemplate an impact fee credit from there. So by eliminating the impact fee for that project, if you're not also partnering or contemplating the infrastructure needs for that site, you may be technically eliminating a budget item, but one that's been replicated on the concurrency side.
Right.
Very good point. Catherine, you wanted to add on?
Oh yeah, sorry. So in Bradenton, we got to the point with transportation impact fees, we weren't building any more new roads and we weren't adding capacity anywhere. The main roads were FDOT roads anyway, and the county had a number of roads in our jurisdiction. And so we hadn't switched to a mobility fee yet. We were working on that, but we weren't there yet. And so we were able to definitely waive transportation impact fees for affordable housing without being really impacted financially. It's not like we were bonding or building anything anyway. And so we were absolutely able to do that. And sometimes the transportation fees are the most expensive ones next to education. But I agree that finding those credits is very important. And we were very aggressive on that end before the statute changed in 2019. Just being able to find those credits were a big deal.
But one of the things that we're concerned about with the recent change in the impact fee law is that, and this is coming from our legal staff, is that the court decisions indicate that there has to be this rational nexus. So we question whether or not a law can just sit there and say you don't have to have anything. Now, who's going to challenge this? That's going to be the other question. But the concept is that should you still, as a local government, not necessarily the term waive is not appropriate. The appropriate term is not charge them, but use another funding source, such as either a local affordable housing trust fund or the general fund, to basically pay for the fees that were supposed to be done for that. And Jessica, you bring up something it didn't even really dawn on me, is that we here in Volusia County have still got a considerable amount of raw land that is being developed, and it is being developed for some affordable housing. And part of that is the need for the basic infrastructure just to get there. And so they are seeing those credits helping them out from a pro forma perspective. So it's going to be a real interesting discussion about that particular tool and how we can take it and really implement it. Because we in Volusia County have a county-wide thoroughfare road impact fee that's charged inside the cities as well as the unincorporated area. And it is sizable for single family. It is sizable for multifamily. One question, what have y'all's experience in regards to owner occupied affordable housing when you're waiving the fee to guarantee that the unit remains affordable? Because if we as a county steward of the impact fees say it's appropriate to waive this for affordability, the concept in everyone's mind is that it's in perpetuity.
Mhm.
But if you build fee simple single family and there's no restrictions, the next owner can blow that away.
Sure.
So-
That's where the land use restriction agreement comes in. And you can set it up to where if the house sells before whatever period you determine, normally it's like 10 years, 8 years, 10 years, what local governments put into effect. You can have them pay that money back plus interest and, you know, the consumer price index on top of it. You can index it. So that's one tool to give your elected some comfort there that it stays affordable, or you get your money back for sure.
Jessica or Bob, have y'all had any similar experience?
The only thing that I've seen, and again, we haven't done it in Florida, is the deed restrictions. I mean, you can do that way too. Which
You know-
sort of goes back to almost moving toward the communal trust, land trust. But you can do it in the deed by itself.
Well, you know, it goes back because like right now, the state of Florida was at the forefront in the court decisions that, you know, age restricted does not have to pay school impact fees. So if we went through that same situation and kind of tying into what you were saying, Catherine, is that if we see that it is going for a market rate at that point, we have the right to lien the property for the cost of the impact fee. So there's going to be a lot of different discussions about how to utilize that impact fee tool in the most effective way. So, all right, Catherine, we'll move on. Jessica, you're our local land use attorney, and we would appreciate if you could give a kind of a hometown flavor of what's happening here in Volusia County and what you see successfully working and some of the things that we could potentially improve.
Absolutely. And I mean, obviously we're here today to talk about this because it's a topic that's become important to a lot of our local governments right now. And we're all kind of starting the conversations of, we know this is the need that we have, and what do we do from here? And so I'm going to, run through, without saying project names or clients, some of the things that we've seen happen recently, and some of the lessons that we can learn from those, and then kind of what we might see in the future. So just what we've seen recently, there are 3 main things that we've seen in projects that have gone through and been successful. And we've already touched on probably all of them during this presentation, which is a good sign. The first one is, no cost land donations with affordable housing deed restrictions. So we were just kind of talking about that. If local governments have the ability to take some surplus land that they have and work with a developer or a nonprofit to turn that into affordable housing, that's something that we've seen that's been really successful. I like numbers, so on a average, say $40 million multifamily project, and I'm using this number based off of a project that I made sure was public record. If you had a $40 million affordable housing project, about 18% of their costs were in land and permitting costs. So about $3 million in land costs and $4 million in permitting and consultants, unfortunately including land use attorneys. But you have to have a good team to get the project done. So any way that you can reduce those land costs, and that also opens the opportunity for single family affordable housing development. I think we see the go-to is discussing rental, market rents. But the ability to restrict single-family construction to where these low-income households can own a home is something that we've seen recently in some of our local governments that has done really well. Another item we've seen work really well is some form of tax increment financing. It's really good for local governments who may not have a existing budget to incentivize affordable housing growth, but by partnering with the developer and saying, if you bring your project here and you invest, you can recapture some of what you're bringing to us over a certain amount of time to offset the cost that you have for the project. We've seen that inside and outside of community redevelopment areas where you see that general kind of TIF setup, and that's been really successful. And then we've also seen, and again in the context of state housing and federal housing credits, and outside of that, just local government preference requests for loans and also selections for funding sources. So we've seen projects that have just leaned on the local government's financial abilities to get better loan rates to assist the project. And I think the county and a lot of our cities have seen a list of requests for that local government preference when they're applying for tax credits over the years. And there are benefits and drawbacks there. Obviously, you can only award one project and then they may not be selected. And we'll kind of probably discuss that a little bit later, but we've seen that recently as well. What we think has worked really well is the land donations, especially on a small lot basis. So Catherine touched on the potential to pull in smaller lot sizes, different unit types, ADUs. There are a lot of local governments in Volusia County that have surplus land, but it may be land that they bought because it was blighted or a home was destroyed in a hurricane or a storm, and they have this inventory of small lots that may be substandard sizes, maybe in blighted areas that they have the ability to declare as surplus and provide at no cost for affordable housing development. What we've seen in those instances, again, you know, an affordable housing deed restriction, I think our period was 10 or 15 years is what we've seen the most. And an important lesson we learned during those deed restriction drafting sessions is that we wanted to set it up to where it must be sold to an affordable housing qualified individual, but they don't have to stay within that qualification. So we don't want to impede our residents' growth by saying we have this affordable housing, you've qualified, congratulations, you're a homeowner. Now you can't increase your salary a certain amount or you lose your house. We don't want to see that situation. But again, if they sold the home later, it would be to another qualified individual. So we don't want to penalize them once they're in the home.
But
We've
you
also
touch
worked
on,
with local governments. Yep.
I just want to say you touched on something there that Bob brought up in his discussion, which is the desire to ensure that folks at an income level that have not been able to build wealth because of lack of home ownership. There was a statistic that came out on NPR probably about 2 months ago where they were talking about the percentage of middle-class white citizens who had built personal wealth through home ownership and that of in the African-American community, and it was a horrible disparity. So as we sit there and go forward, and you touched on it, have you seen that being able to be utilized here in Volusia County yet, or is it still just kind of in its infancy?
You know, I think there's a local nonprofit in Volusia County that I won't name, but people are probably familiar if they're from the area, whose goal it is to focus on the 32114 zip code here in Daytona Beach and Volusia County to end, you know, homelessness and hunger. And part of that is a housing initiative. And they are the ones who we've seen partner with the county and local cities to say, walk people through the financing process, which is a big step. Make sure that they get down payment assistance, which is a huge gatekeeper for the single family ownership that would allow you to build that wealth. And then working with the local governments to draft the restrictions that give the local governments the comfort that they're not giving away a lot that's going to become market rate, but giving that individual the room to grow and make sure that they have a home for their family.
Excellent. All right, sorry, I just didn't mean that. The questions are coming through and I just want to make sure we're getting them out there. And there's some more queuing up, so I'll have to keep interrupting us occasionally. Keep on going.
No problem, absolutely. So then, other than the small lot acquisition, what we've seen a lot is projects that come through that need some sort of incentive financially to offset costs. Like we said, land construction costs are huge these days. And the go-to seems to be a movement towards tax increment financing. Like I said, there's no upfront cost to the local governments. It's kind of, you know, come here and prove yourself, and you can reap some of the benefit that you bring, which I think is a really balanced approach that has worked well. Some of the benefits and drawbacks of that is we see it a lot in community redevelopment agencies. So that's a helpful tool that also I think ties into what we were talking about with impact fee credits, because in those community redevelopment agencies or areas, that's where you see, you know, traffic concurrency exception areas and different rooms for growth that I think are really available to help facilitate this type of discussion, and might be really great to see some affordable housing type products in those areas. but also CRAs expire. So looking at it from outside of a CRA perspective is also important. We've seen that happen. We call it a synthetic TIF here in our office. And we've seen, the county and local governments pair on projects like that to bring that forward, which is really exciting. Some areas that we think we could grow in the future, and I think that we've seen come up a few times, is the local government preference for tax credits. I think the county recently reviewed 6 applicants and they selected one. And I think the first comment was, it's fantastic that we have 6 people who are applying at this level and want to bring projects forward. And I think affordable housing developers know that when they bring a project forward and they're relying on those type of credits, that it may be a few what they call cycles before they get the funding. And so a discussion that we've had with some local government or some affordable housing developers is it helpful if local governments commit to the local government financial assistance for a longer term than maybe one cycle? Is it good to commit for 2 so that you have that assurity when you go in again that it's already in place? So we've seen that come up. Obviously, there are some drawbacks. If the local government says you have our commitment for 2 years, we want to make sure that you have the best chances the next year. What if a better project comes along? And that's kind of, a bird in the hand is better than a bird in the bush and whatnot. Other tools that I think we've talked about a lot already today, but I wanted to hit on ADUs. Absolutely, we see that movement starting here in Volusia County. I think the county has a really structured ADU program that I think local governments are taking a look at, the location criteria and all of those. Smaller lot sizes, especially in downtown and urban infill areas, tiny home lots. We've got a few cottage style developments that have come in at a market rate, but it'd be interesting to see that market grow and have them come in as an affordable housing provider. It was interesting, Catherine said, they don't have to plat, but they're still seeing a single family. Some of the local governments here have just interpreted them as multifamily, which is helpful, so that you don't have that issue, as long as it's, one platted lot where it is for rental. So that's a tool that we've seen to help those projects move forward. Impact fee credits, we've discussed. Partnerships of running utilities, we touched on that, Clay. Linkage fees is something that Bob can obviously voice on, but I think when you look at that conversation, there's a saying, and I can't remember who said it or I'd attribute it to them, but they said, housing doesn't necessarily create the need for more housing. So it's looking at those studies and seeing how commercial and industrial can help contribute to that overall need as well, is something that I think we will see moving forward. And then, everybody's hit on the others: density bonuses, parking studies, anything you can do to make affordable housing easier to accomplish at an administrative level, rather than having to go through public hearings that take time and insert a level of uncertainty in the process for developers who are trying to have a standard pro forma and timeline for their lenders and things like that, is always helpful. So that's kind of a punch list there. I'm hoping that we have questions on it so we can expand.
Oh yeah, we've got quite a few questions coming in. I wanted to make sure we could get through because we are getting further and further, but let me go ahead and start reading through some of the questions we've received. Increasing household income is essential, and that's done by making it possible for people to work and be more productive and reliable while on the job. Preschool and after-school programs are essential, so parents know their kids are in a safe place, fun place. So I guess where we're really kind of coming into, and it may tie into some of the linkage fees discussions. Is there something that could be done to help ensure that as someone comes in with affordable housing, that there is this component of tying economic development and provision of other services to that? Have you all had any experience with that in regards to your experiences here locally or across the state or in other states of the country? Bob, Catherine, help me.
We had a number of tax credit projects come through Bradenton when I was the director. One of them was able to do mixed income and mixed use. Sorry, my dog is driving me crazy. Excuse you, sir. But when they come in for those applications, when they come in to you for your signatures, when they come to the planning director, for instance, and say they have to show that they're proximate to transit, they have to show that they're proximate to medical, to schools, to all those things. Those requirements are already set up for them anyway. So the local governments don't necessarily have to worry about that so much from that level, because they have to show the Florida Housing Finance Corporation that they meet all those proximity standards. A lot of local governments will try to tie things like density bonuses and things like that to jobs, but it's so fluid. It's hard for the applicant and even the local government to track those things. That's what we found in a study that we're doing for Hillsborough County right now. So one of our recommendations to the staff is going to be to loosen up on that requirement, because it's something like 200 jobs that like a new project with 200 jobs for them to be able to give a density bonus. That's a lot. And you see those kinds of things going on in business districts and in downtown, and not necessarily in places that have cheaper land, for instance, but they're still proximate to transit. So loosening up that restriction is probably a good idea, knowing that those things are going to be satisfied by the tax credit requirements anyway, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, I mean, you bring up a very interesting point, though, that, the fact is trying to hit the home run with the large scale project every time as your only target. You're really cutting out a larger percentage of the local developers.
Right.
The fact is that if you have someone who has some underutilized or vacant property in a urban setting, I mean, I can sit here and I can visualize driving down US 1 through the cities of Ormond Beach, Holly Hill, Daytona Beach, into Port Orange, into New Smyrna Beach, and let's not forget South Daytona, where there are these opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So it does bring up that you do need to make sure that you have those services in close proximity and that you're not just excluding it from smaller development. I'm sorry, Bob, I interrupted you.
I was just going to hit the issue of non-residential linkage fees, because again, that's sort of our specialty. We're doing that all around the state. That specifically addresses that jobs with households equate to the need for workforce housing. And it's a two-way street, because we wear an economic development hat also. And you don't get a lot of economic development if you don't have housing for the people. So it's circular. Within that process, which basically points out, ultimately in every study I've ever done, it's the service industry that tends to present the biggest issues. Offices are somewhat neutral, but you have to remember their secretaries and all the other things that go that have a lower. Industrial lately has been pretty good in terms of wage capabilities and affordable housing and the like. Hotels are another somewhat of a negative, especially on the type, whether it's a smaller one or not. But what I'm trying to get at, I think in the big picture, which we touched on and maybe didn't get into, when we do linkage fees or whatever, the first thing we say, it's got to go into a housing trust fund. Okay. So once you've opened that box, housing trust funds, of which you can have it for all sorts of things, you do have the ability to do when those monies do not necessarily have to be brick and mortar. They allow you to do a lot of different things into the process. And I think from my perspective as an economist and a planner, that has a lot of opportunity if you can create a lot of different funding sources that flow into that housing trust fund, and not just a linkage fee or some of the other things, but use your other sources to flow into. Then you have, I think, a tool that sort of defeats the silos, because a lot of the things we just addressed are social issues that have a whole different funding mechanism to it, and the for good or for bad, the two don't talk. unless maybe we're dealing with nonprofits where we can deal with it. But I'm just throwing those out.
Thank you. Jessica, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and I think what Bob says about the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is interesting. Once he said you can use it for a variety of things, my brain went, oh, like extending infrastructure to an affordable housing project would be really interesting, you know, if it's not on county land or if it's in a place that doesn't have those services. So.
Now, I'm going to hit another one we haven't addressed, but it's again one of my sales pitches to most of my clients is if the government is helping fund infrastructure, which in many cases it has to, that infrastructure, once built, becomes part of the land cost. So the question I have, seeing that federal government and state governments grants are getting harder and harder to get, is there's an opportunity to take that infrastructural funding that gets built into the process and become basically a joint venture land partner, so that you know what the land cost was before, you know what it is after, and that's the one you're sharing with. And so when that gets sold, and I want to hit that, come back to that in a second, when that gets sold, you, the government, then get a return, assuming it's positive, that can then be put back into a trust fund in the process. So it's another source that when we throw that out there, and making sure that everything we do is CPI indexed. That's just critical. But that's another way of addressing the issue that we're trying to sell.
Excellent. Next question is, the county and local governments collectively have hundreds of millions of dollars in all kinds of reserve accounts. Can't some of those be pooled into a below market, low entrance loan facility to finance projects? I am not our financial leader here at Volusia County, nor do I play one on TV, but I can tell you this much, is that as we've come out of our budget process, you'll see many of these reserves are tied to specific accounts for specific purposes. So it restricts our ability to go in there and be able to take something that's reserved, say, for a stormwater utility, and to utilize it for affordable housing. Because again, in order to be transparent with some of these dedicated funding sources, local governments have said, here's what we're going to be either taxing or charging a property owner or a developer or a business or under a franchise fee. This is for this project only, and we cannot spend it for anything else. So is there an opportunity for that? It's hard to say. You would have to look and see what is your safety factor that you need to have in your reserves to address a hurricane, to address any of these a wildfire. Few folks remember the wildfires of '98 here. That was a very expensive situation that hit us. So again, it can be, but it's more of basically looking at what your general fund reserves are and whether or not you're comfortable with those levels.
Clay, there's another one. It's hard, but we've been able to do some, like in Fort Lauderdale. What you said is correct. There's another side, which are pension funds. And whether or not the county and or what other pension funds there are want to take 5% or 10% and try to fund some of these.
Well, right now, Volusia County is part of the state retirement system, so that would be that pension program. So that, unfortunately,
that's out.
That's not an option to us in Volusia County. And I believe there's 2 other cities that are also part of that. So that may not be something there, but we can bring that up as an option. Why not a voter-approved ad valorem assessment to finance affordable housing projects like Volusia Forever and Echo? Those of you who may not be familiar with Volusia County, we have two voter approved, I mean, overwhelmingly, like 75% of the voters came out and voted for Volusia Forever, which acquires conservation lands for preservation purposes and protection of natural resources, and ECHO, which stands for environmental, cultural, historical, and outdoor uses. Something like that could be done. It would have to be, again, that is a process where through the county council, they would have to identify that they want to do this, and it would be an ad valorem onto the property taxes. And it would have to be approved by a voters referendum. So it's not something that we can do tomorrow by an automatic approval of the county council. It would be a detailed process.
Pinellas County did it, and it's an important source of funding for affordable housing.
They did didn't they do pennies for Pinellas? That was their
Correct.
program.
It's a sales
Correct.
tax.
To sell it, to sell it, they had to, you have to address a lot of different pockets that you have to satisfy. It's not just affordable housing, it's where that money is being allocated to get a big enough vote, if you will. But the portion that's going to affordable housing is very good.
And Bob, you bring up a critical point. Regardless of whether it's ad valorem, where you see it on your property tax, or if it's a sales tax like what Pinellas County, it would still require a voter referendum for there to be approval of it. Right. And so that in and of itself is a process that has to go through a vetting through the public. The local elected officials need to support it, and there has to be actual language committed to that so that you can put it on the ballot. So it is something that is feasible. It does take a considerable amount of work. We have a question that I think may have been addressed, but I think needs to be brought back. How do you ensure that property is resold to another affordable housing client is maintained that it be affordable, and who manage that? Should it be local government or should it be not-for-profit?
Let me answer from my perspective.
As an example of what.
All right, I'm going to call Jessica. Let her speak now,
Okay.
Bob. How's that?
Fine.
Thank you, sir.
Got it. I would say just from the local perspective of what we've done in this county so far, is when an affordable housing development comes forward, obviously there's an affordable housing deed restriction that's associated with the project. And that deed restriction so far has said something along the lines of when the property is sold, the city or local government, the county, has to consent to the sale. And as part of that review and consent, the seller has to provide information, usually, tax documents or something like that, that show that the buyer is tax qualified. Where this gives you a really good opportunity for partnership is that, generally speaking, the sellers are working in tandem with the local housing authorities to match up potential buyers so that they already know that they are within that income range.
And Bob, jump in there. I agree.
I agree. It's a staffing issue also, ultimately. I agree that if you have enough staff in your housing side of the equation, it is good. We've, in many cases, recommended on the affordable side going to a nonprofit. Is there a nonprofit that can overview if you have a staffing issue? Again, when you use Coral Gables, very, very wealthy area like that, but they just said, hey, we want to do something, but we don't want to be responsible for the ongoing. So they were looking for a management group, if you would, to take it over, and that would be a nonprofit, which I think is a very positive in a number of ways, but that's another approach. But you have to have somebody to manage it. I mean, there's no doubt. You just can't say and let it by itself say, okay, it's deed restricted or whatever. You've got to have capabilities of monitoring it all the way through the process, the sale of it to begin with, and carry on.
Catherine, did you have experience on that when you were working in Bradenton and any of your other current clients as a consultant?
Habitat for Humanity in Bradenton was the main group that we partnered with on that. they, typically try to buy, surplus land from the local government, or in a number of cases, we had properties that had code enforcement liens on them. And they would come in and ask for those liens to be waived. And so we did have a land use restriction agreement set up with Habitat for those instances, but they were good partners in making sure that those units stayed affordable.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We're running short on time, so I've got one last question, and it's really more of a comment, and it kind of ties back into this recent law that all local governments here in the state of Florida have to have a private property rights act or private property element. The comment is outside investors looking for a quick flip is a hindrance to local home ownership by existing residents. The purchase is required for them to provide. In other words, the outside purchaser comes in, buys it for an investment, and turns it into a rental. And that, by then, because they're willing to pay so much, puts the local potential buyer into the being forced to rent. Is there really anything from a local government perspective that can do anything to curb that? I have to tell you, I am really not aware of anything that we can do to restrict that, other than coming up with, as we were talking about, community land trust, other types of programs where it's targeted for a specific income. But even then, if you had someone moving into the area, they would still qualify, correct?
Correct. Let me hit that, because I think it's an issue. I don't think it's anywhere near as big as some of the stories imply, because a lot of it are the big buyers, the REITs and stuff that are getting into. And in many ways, some of them is very positive. Some now are actually building rental subdivisions into the process. And on top of that, again, depending on your age, we got to remember demographics and ethnicity plays an important part in housing. And as we addressed earlier, the family, married family with 2 kids, I think I just saw something represents 17% of the households now in the United States. So when we're addressing, there are a lot of people in that paradigm shift of ownership to rental that want rental. Okay. And it's a complex issue. But having said that, there's 2 sides, and on one side is, it is becoming available and providing housing and the like. And the big boys tend to maintain the units. So it's not like an individual turning it.
I have to be timekeeper here. We are getting closer and closer to the end of our time frame. So I'm going to give everybody, if you want to take 30 seconds, that's great. If not, if there's anything that you just want to touch on that you feel hasn't been touched on today. So Catherine, could you start us off? Is there anything that you feel we need to touch on before we get closer to sign off?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground today. This was great, Clay. Thank you.
All right. Jessica, anything that you would like to add?
No, I agree. I would say I think we've got a big toolbox. It's time to see how we implement it now. So
excellent. And Bob, I'll give you last word for the day before I go with the closeout presentation and plug for our 7th.
I just wanted to say thank you for letting us be a part of the process. And I look forward to working with you down the line.
We really appreciate it. This has been a very good discussion. I think we got a lot of things out there. Just to kind of take this forward, I believe we got all the questions answered, but if you didn't, please supply those to us and we will make sure we incorporate it as we go forward to the December 7th summit. If you have not registered for the December 7th, please go to www.volusia.org and go to our Community Assistance Division, and you will see up there in the upper right-hand corner the summit that's coming on. We really look forward to having that happen. everybody who's participating today, please make it a point of being there. We will have basically a breakout session where the group you see here before you will be getting deeper and deeper into the topics, and will be available to answer much more specific questions so that we can create a list of things for more in-depth analysis that will hopefully come into a master plan that we'll be able to share countywide, so that we have the public sector, the not-for-profit sector, the for-profit sector, all working together to try and address our affordable housing. I think that's about it. If there's anything else from our esteemed panel, I think we're done for the day. And please join us on October 22nd when we will be having the third of these interactive sessions. Thank y'all.